this for about 20 years, and that means that almost always when I stand up in front of audiences, which I do basically every week, one way or another, I'm the veteran. You know, there's hardly anyone there who's been in this business longer than me. But here, well, I mean, I don't know about Maria, but certainly everyone else up here has been in this business longer than me. And I know a lot of the people, a lot of you guys too. It's pretty remarkable. But we have to remember one thing, and I think actually Jim just mentioned it right at the end of his remarks. We perhaps need to look at that thing I've just said as a problem rather than as a good thing. The fact that we're talking to each other more than we are successfully anyway talking to the rest of the world. Now, I think I've been reasonably successful over the past 20 years, and certainly over the past 10 years, in getting the word out, you know, getting, contributing to change in the nature of the debate about this. But we all know that there's a hell of a long way to go. So I decided that what I would do with my 10 minutes up here is to share some of the things I've learned over the past while with regard to what works and what is the most effective way for us as advocates of the defeat of aging to be better advocates, more effective advocates. I just want to give you some little tidbits of what I do, how I do this, and what I think works. Now, you all know the kind of reactions that you get when you talk to most people about this kind of thing. This is where it all begins. People will say, oh my God, let's not go there. We're going to have too many people and hardly anyone's going to get access to these things. You know, the depth of irrationality about this is demonstrated by these top two things. Most people who say one of these things will say both of them, absolutely not noticing that the two things are mutually exclusive. You know, that you can't possibly have overpopulation if hardly anyone has access to the therapy. You know, people just kind of don't notice that dictator is fairly high on the league table of risky jobs, and not many of them die of aging. You know, it's fairly sad. And of course, it's really miserable having to spend my time talking about all of this all the time the way I have to. I really don't enjoy it any more than you do. But the question is, how do we actually change that? How do we get people to mainly have as their first reaction the reactions they ought to have about the sociological consequences of moving to a post-aging world? The fact that we wouldn't have any people with Alzheimer's anymore. The fact that the elderly would be able to carry on contributing wealth to society so that we would all be more prosperous even if these therapies were expensive. You know, all of these things that are perfectly obvious to everyone in this room. How do we get that to be obvious to everyone who's not in this room? This is the fundamental problem, and I want to stop here for a moment, because this is really, to my mind, where the problem begins, why this is so difficult. People have these two types of pessimism in their heads. On the one hand, they're pessimistic about the feasibility. They say, well, aging is this natural thing, fixing it is like creating perpetual motion, it's just obviously impossible. That's where they're at. And on the other hand, the same people at the same time have this in their heads. They think aging is actually probably a much better thing than it looks at first sight. Fixing it might be a much worse thing than it looks at first sight. And the problem, of course, is these two things synergize. We have a catch-22 where people are unwilling to engage in rational debate about whether aging really is immutable because they've already decided that it's a good thing and therefore even if we could fix it, we wouldn't want to. And the same people, at the same time, will take the view that there's no point in having a proper conversation about whether aging is desirable because they've already decided that it's immutable and therefore the whole question is academic. You know, so the first step, and I really want to emphasize this to everybody here, the first step whenever you talk to anyone about any of this is you've got to embarrass them into a little bit of intellectual rigor. A little bit of appreciation that it is absolutely unacceptable to do this. You've got to be able to address these two questions individually rather than tying them together. That's the first thing. So, I'm just going to spend 2 slides on how I go about addressing the question of aging being desirable. The first thing I do is I actually have really good specific answers to all of the stupid questions. You know, when people say, oh dear, there's going to be too many people, you can't just wave your hand and say, no, I don't think so. You've got to actually have as much information, specific arguments at your fingertips to be able to convince people that they haven't thought about it enough. They've got to know that they haven't thought about it as much as you have. And so you've got to know things like the fertility rate and the rate of decrease of fertility rate. You've got to know things like how much the carrying capacity of the planet would be increased if we eliminated all fossil fuels by inventing good solar energy or nuclear fusion or whatever. You've got to be able to put meat on the argument for optimism. That's very important. However, you mustn't overdo it. You mustn't say that because you think these technologies are going to happen or these trends are going to continue, therefore it is stupid to be worried about these things. You've got to acknowledge that it's possible that solving the problem we have today, that Jim just described very carefully, or maybe it was Dave actually, of 100,000 people dying every day, solving that problem might create new problems. You can't dismiss that out of hand. But what you can do is ask people to adopt a sense of proportion. You've got to ask them whether they really honestly will raise their hand and say with a straight face that they think the problems that could be created by the solution to the problem we have today are bigger than the problem we have today, such that it would be a bad idea to solve the problem we have today. Okay. Now, how bad is it? Even if we had to actually choose to have fewer children than we would like to in order to make room for all these tedious old people who are still healthy and not dying, right? You know, how bad is that? It's actually pretty hard to argue that it's better to let people get Alzheimer's and cancer and atherosclerosis and go through all these years of disease and debilitation and misery rather than just having only half as many kids as we otherwise might want to. You know, it's pretty hard to argue that. That's a really important thing to do. Sense of proportion. Get people to really put their hand up and say that they really believe that the future potential problems are worse than the current problem. And then there's the third one down here. This is perhaps the most unequivocal one, and it's your ace in the hole that you need when you are having these arguments. Even if you can't convince people that these problems are fictitious, that they won't happen because of various reasons. And even if you also can't convince people that even if these problems did exist, they would be less severe than the problem we have today, you've still got this. Who the hell are we to say, oh dear, this or that problem will occur, it'll be really bad, let's not go there? Because if we say that, what we're doing is condemning a whole cohort of people in the future to the same kind of disease and disability and death that we have today. When, in practice, if we had moved faster, we would have developed these therapies sooner, those people would have had the opportunity to take advantage of those therapies. What we were doing, therefore, is we would be second-guessing. Now, humanity of the future is entitled to make their own decisions, especially because they'll have better information. People 50 years from now will know whether we are going to develop nuclear fusion, for example, within the next 50 years, because it will be in the past in 50 years' time. They will have better information. Therefore, that's the biggest reason why they are entitled to make this choice for themselves rather than having us make it for them. So, those are the three things. Know the answers, tell people about the concept of sense of proportion, and tell people that they do not have the right to make decisions on behalf of the future of humanity. That three-step argument really works quite well. It shuts people up really fast, and also it genuinely changes some minds. Of course, some people are, you can't change their minds, whatever you do. But we don't need to change everybody's mind. Every single mind we change makes a difference, especially if that person happens to be highly wealthy. Okay, but hands up anyone in the audience who does not know anyone who is wealthier than they are. That's pretty good. Okay, remember that when you think about who to use this on, all right? So, this is the only other slide I'm going to put up about the whole business of desirability. You all know this, but I have become, a notch more aggressive about this with every year that's gone by. 10, 15 years ago when I started giving talks like this, I never even thought about having to make remarks like this. It was so bleeding obvious what I'm saying on this slide that, I mean, the idea of insulting my audience by spelling it out made no sense to me. But as time's gone on, I have recognized that one has to do this. You have to actually point out that longevity is a side effect. It's a fantastic side effect, don't get me wrong, but it's a side effect. Being sick is risky, and it's always going to be risky. Being sick is the main risk factor for death. Therefore, if we develop medicines that stop you from getting sick, in other words, any medicine, we're going to increase, on average, how long you're going to live. It so happens that the kind of medicine that Sense Research Foundation works on is going to make a very big difference to how long people will live on average, but it's still just a side effect. And you have to say this, because if you don't say it, people will still get stuck in what I'm sure you all know is called the Tiffin error. The idea of thinking that working on medicine for aging means working on how to keep people alive for a nice long time in a horrible state of health, when we all know that that's the exact opposite of what we're really talking about. All right, so now half a dozen slides on feasibility. Because ultimately, this is what you've got to do. When you have embarrassed people into addressing the feasibility question and the desirability question separately, you'll be able to find out pretty quickly which of them the particular person you're talking to is more hung up on. Some people are more hung up on whether the whole thing is a good idea. Other people are more hung up on whether the whole thing is feasible. So, feasibility. If you need to address this, this is how to do it. You start by saying, this is what you probably think, and this is wrong. This is a perfectly uncontroversial way to classify types of ill health into 4 different categories. There's infections, there's congenital diseases, there's the progressive accumulating diseases of old age, and then there's this thing called aging itself, these non-specific nebulous things that most people don't think of as disease. That classification into 4 categories is perfectly fine, nothing wrong with it at all. The thing that's wrong with this slide is the location of this big black line. Most people think of aging as so separate from all of these that it's not really medical. It's not really something that's amenable to medical intervention. When you think that, obviously you're going to think of it as natural. You're going to think of it as something that's not worth thinking about, doing anything about. And you might even get to think of it as desirable. This is an enormous part of the problem. And it's the reason why we spend far too much money in the wrong way in medical research as well as medical practice. This is the correct answer. The classification is exactly the same. The black line should be here. The difference between column 3 and column 4 is purely semantic. There is nothing that biologically separates them. The only difference is these are the ones that we choose to give disease-like names to, and these are the ones that we don't. But all of them in category 3 and category 4 are side effects of being alive in the first place. They happen late in life and not early in life precisely because they are caused by the lifelong progressive accumulation of damage, which is harmless at a low level but harmful at a high level. So if we think about things this way, we actually can see what to do. We can see that, first of all, we are grossly over-optimistic in society, over-optimistic, yes, that's what I said, about column 3. We think we can cure these things. We think of these things as if they're in column 1, as if they're like infections. You know, we think that we can actually eliminate them from the body. Well, hello, you can't eliminate something from the body which is a side effect of being alive without eliminating being alive, which would rather defeat the object. So let's not do that. You've got to actually treat these things differently, and it makes us, of course, over-pessimistic about column 4. We don't think about the options. We don't think about how to intervene earlier on in the chain of events that go from being alive, that's metabolism, to being dead over here. We attack these pathologies as if we could eliminate them. This is, of course, the alternative that people have historically focused on, trying to exploit what we know about the variation in the rate of aging in nature. That also hasn't worked, basically because of this, because metabolism is rather complicated, and you just can't mess with it in a manner that doesn't have unintended consequences. But we have this. We have the phenomenon of preventative maintenance, periodic preventative maintenance throughout the lifetime of a machine that successfully extends the fully functioning lifespan of the machine arbitrarily long. 10 times longer in this case than the machine was designed to last. Okay? That is what we should be able to do with the much more complicated machine that we call the human body, and that, of course, is what the maintenance approach is, the sense approach. No, don't try and fiddle with metabolism to slow down the creation of damage. Don't try and fiddle with pathology in the face of the accumulation of damage, but rather fiddle with the damage itself. Eliminate it periodically from the body so that it never reaches the level of abundance that's bad for you, even though it is still being created. And of course, if people start getting technical, then you can get technical too. As technical as you possibly can, that would be wonderful. But you don't need to know all this. You can point them to sense.org if they want to know this much. If you can get them to ask questions about this, you have done your job. You have got them to the point where they're actually paying attention. And that is the first step that 98% of the human race has not made. If we can reduce that number to 97%, we will take 10 years off the time it takes to cure aging. And that is your job. I'll stop there. I won't really stop there. I'll just do one more slide. I'll just say, if you get that far, you may get a hesitation on the basis of, well, hang on, who is saying this? Are people in authority, people we can trust saying this? You can point them to our research advisory board, these 25 enormously prominent luminaries, specialist world leaders in all areas of medicine. You can point them to the fact that we're publishing in the peer-reviewed literature. You can point them to the conference that we're going to run in August. You can say, listen, this is for real. This is no longer just one strange guy with an accent and a beard getting up on stage and shouting. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.